this. Butter-top bread and soft dinner rolls by Home Pride.
Hey, get the big bold buckwheats taste at breakfast.
Pass the buck, pass the buck, pass the buckwheats.
Well, today's the day we're going to start, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of friends who traveled with us watching Cindy
yes,
to see
I hope
what
we
took
do.
place. We took 40 Minnesotans along with us, and it was quite a time. And we hit so many of the spots we saw yesterday. I don't know about you, Cindy, but I got a special thrill seeing so many of the spots we had visited yesterday on TV.
I was saying it's very hard to describe what a wonderful feeling it is to celebrate a 200th birthday without it sounding corny and insincere, but people really feel it.
Well, we hope you enjoy the recalling of our trip as much as we do. So why don't we start out? We saw just at the top of the show the way things began, and of course right here at our Wool Chamberlain Field where we all started to get acquainted, and we all started to say hello, meet each other, and we're handing out tickets and so forth here, Cindy. It normally doesn't take very long when you travel with people.
To get to know them.
To get to know them.
Right.
Pleasant
and you can
experience.
sense here they were all filled with anticipation and all very excited about the trip.
You know, there were some interesting firsts. There were a couple of our friends who were flying for the first time, which was kind of an interesting introduction as well. During our films, you'll see frequently these silver tags, and those are the AAA tags. Of course, we were traveling with worldwide travel of AAA, and you'll see those tags. That's the way you'll be able to identify the folks who were on our trip. Arriving in Philadelphia. That's where it all happens, Cindy. That's the seat of things.
And this is, of course, the freeway from the airport into town, and many interesting sights. For example, the Schuylkill River, places that I'd never seen before.
The city of Philadelphia, of course, is where people collected, where Continental Congress took place, and where so many important decisions were made. And of course, this brand new, beautiful building, which now houses the Liberty Bell. We had the tendency to touch it. I noticed that yesterday, too.
A funny thrill, isn't it?
There is the crack in the Liberty Bell. Jack Jones did his marvelous job of photographing our whole trip. And of course, now they allow people in groups, and they tell you all about the Liberty Bell. Actually, this is at the other end of the mall from Independence Hall.
Now, here are all these people rushing up to touch it. It really is a thrill. I mean, you do feel like you're touching something so filled with history. It's incredible.
I think you have the same kind of feeling when you walk into Independence Hall here, which of course was, here's the room where it happened, a 40 by 40 foot room where all those discussions took place, where the Declaration was eventually signed. But when you grab a doorknob or you touch a desk and you know that people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin did that very same thing, it's better than reading the history books, I must say.
This young fellow was so nice. He described to us his sentry uniform and a lot of details about what it was like to be a soldier at that time.
Interesting how deeply filled with history they are.
I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle Doodle die.
And of course, the modern kind of fills things too. There are all sorts of souvenirs to buy. Some, I would say, kind of disturb me a little bit.
Yes, but I must admit I was taken in by it. I bought myself a T-shirt that said Philadelphia 1976.
Well, I guess it certainly is further evidence of the fact that we are a commercial nation. Free enterprise is very important to our way of life. Then a short stop there to buy a few souvenirs, and we moved on to the home of Betsy Ross. Once again, I guess we, throughout the week, are going to use the expression that it was a moment that kind of stops you when you realize that, for instance, this is where Old Glory was first designed and put together.
All those people going through Betsy's house, I wonder if she ever expected them for lunch or whatever.
Perhaps not. You know, that design has stood well over the years. I heard a very famous designer say the other day, I can't think of one way that I would change our national emblem because it just seems to be perfect. Here was kind of an interesting experience. I told you how quickly you learn to know each other and enjoy each other's presence. The first night, as we normally do on tours of this sort, we kind of get together at a get-acquainted dinner. And this was an especially enjoyable one. We chatted, we had a little fun, played a few games and things of that sort.
What is so fascinating, Bill, are the different backgrounds of all the people who went with us on the trip. And it's very exciting that all these different kinds of people so interested in our nation's history.
And come together and enjoy a very similar experience. This little building here was one of the buildings in which the troops stayed that year just before the confrontation between British troops. George Washington here at Valley Forge had something like 15,000 troops who spent the winter here. Many of them died.
From starvation as well as freezing to death.
Here's General Washington's headquarters, still in place. Same doorknob you grasp when you go through the door, which he did in those years, 200 years ago. This church is near the spot where General Washington was seen praying. Not exactly on the spot, but near it, where he was seen praying on that Christmas Eve.
I think it's lovely that they do hold services there and you can attend.
They do indeed. You know, yesterday, Cindy, this whole Valley Forge area was made a national park. It had been a Pennsylvania state park, but of course the cost in caring for this large an area, 2,000 acres, and keeping it as you see it here, keeping it so beautifully, was rather considerable. So yesterday it became the responsibility of all of us rather than just the people of Pennsylvania.
That's very good.
And then we went through Pennsylvania Dutch country, which is kind of a misnomer, and we'll explain why in just a couple of moments, and we'll explain too why it is an important part of our bicentennial celebration. We'll be back in a moment. You know, Cindy, heading from Philadelphia down to Washington, D.C., it just takes a little bit of a jog to hit what they call Pennsylvania Dutch country. It's near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I understand one of the richest farming lands in the country. But as we were talking a while ago, it is more significant than just idle curiosity to view the Amish right now, because they actually tried to stop the way they live in about the 1780s. That's the way they still live, and of course that was revolutionary time.
And that's right, and they made the point very clear as we were traveling through the area that the Amish do want to share their lifestyle with us and want to educate us about their beliefs and why they live the way they live.
So why don't we drive through Amish country and perhaps tell you a little bit more about what they do believe and what they do want to share with us as we proceed. One of the things, of course, you can't help but notice as you arrive in the area that this is the way they travel. Also, there was a farm. Now, this farm you'll see has some modern conveniences and certainly has tourists. You wouldn't find this on a normal Amish home farm, but this is an old Amish homestead that was bought by a gentleman who wanted to help them to spread their beliefs and their feelings. Strangely enough, the farm itself is still operated by an Amish family. The house is split in two. One side of it has electricity, as you can see here, and is lit for the visitors so they can see how the Amish live. The other side is the homestead of the family, which actually farms the land.
And yet it is kept quite plain. In fact, they are called the plain folk. And as you can see, if you go through it, they have very little furniture, very little belongings, and really no luxuries.
That's right. There are several types of plain people, as they call themselves. The Amish are the plainest of the plain. Also, there are Mennonites. I would suspect that perhaps these may be either Mennonites or River Brethren, because the Amish prefer, these people obviously have cooperated in having their pictures taken, and the Amish prefer not to have their picture taken because of one of their beliefs based upon a biblical passage. We will comment so frequently this week on how the contemporary and the past come together in this area. Certainly this is true of all the cars intermixed, slow-moving vehicle sign on the back of this Amish vehicle.
But they do fit into the traffic there. It's incredible. They don't interrupt the flow of traffic.
The person who took us through, who was a school teacher, and he happened to be working in the off-season as a guide, had great respect for the Amish. And I know you and I talked about this before we arrived, that it was a shame to view them as a curiosity.
Right.
And he had such great respect for them that I think we felt a little relieved that we were seeing them as people to be respected and to be concerned about.
He did make it very clear that he had many Amish friends, and they want us to share in their lifestyle and see what it's like.
Not to intrude, but to share. Notice how beautiful. We're going to see a contrast here. If you watch very closely, you see these two young gentlemen in a courting buggy. Look at them wave at us. Arms and legs in the air, just waving and having a grand time. So they aren't terribly sober people. They enjoy life in their own way.
Those two are getting into a little trouble by doing that, though.
Right. That was a courting buggy, which the youngsters have. Now here is a family buggy. I understand they only have 2 different kinds of buggies they use.
The courting buggy I found so fascinating. It's given to a boy at, what did they say, 16?
Yes.
And he uses it to bring a girl home from a sing-along or a nightly meeting, and that's how they get to know each other, in the buggy.
You'll note that there are Amish farms next to other farms here. I understand they make excellent neighbors, but take a look here, Cindy, not an electric wire leading to that farm. Just wind power and sun power helping to grow the crops. They only go to school until about the 6th grade. They have their own schools. But their concern is that they teach their youngsters to be involved as farmers in agriculture.
If you could have looked through that fence back there a moment ago, you would have seen many, many of the carriages at one house, because it was Sunday when we were there, and they were meeting for their church service, which lasts 4 hours. And it's at one person's home in the neighborhood, and they all meet, and after the service, they spend the afternoon eating and talking and having a nice picnic.
And they spend every other Sunday doing this. They feel, I guess, that they get enough during one Sunday to carry them for 2 weeks. You can see, every now and then, if you see the electric lines going to a farm, you know it is not an Amish farm.
They keep everything so neat because they believe that cleanliness is next to godliness, and their homes and their property, everything is kept very neat.
Look at how they intermix here. Automobiles, then a buggy. Here's a young gentleman in a courting buggy. Looks like he's falling
He's alone.
Right.
The interesting thing is they are some of the wealthiest farmers in the country, but they're not wealthy with money, they're wealthy with land. And they grow, in this part, the Pennsylvania Dutch, they grow tobacco and corn.
They want to continue there. You know, it's interesting that we discovered 90%, over 90% of the youngsters are staying with it. It was our immediate reaction that I would suspect, being exposed to other life as they are, obviously they live in towns with people who have cars and motion pictures and all that sort of thing, one would suspect that many of the youngsters would be leaving, but over 90% stay with the beliefs, the tradition, and everything else.
And they do make some compromises. They read newspapers and different periodicals, and they do have a telephone, one telephone for the whole neighborhood in case they have to make calls to order feed or whatever. And some boys, as we found out, are allowed to have a car at 16 if their father is very liberal. But they lose it when they're baptized into the religion at 18.
So for 2 years, they kind of raise a little Cain. Also, their consideration is not that they just want to wipe out all progress. It's the difference between luxury and necessity. We were there on Sunday, so they weren't farming. But if you see their farm equipment, frequently they will have a gasoline engine running such a thing as a hay baler, but it will be pulled by horses. But because to pull it with a tractor, they would consider a luxury. Remarkable people, people to be respected, and part of that big mix which we call America, important to observe on our birthday. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away.
You know, Cindy, all the places we've visited certainly have immersed us in the history of our country in the 200 years since our country began. But this is 300 years we're talking about here. Literally 100 years before our nation was born, this property was purchased by George Washington's great-grandfather.
Isn't that incredible?
It really is.
We were talking before, it has a very southern plantation feeling, which of course is what it was.
Exactly so. It has a sadness about it, too, because as we know, as we've been talking, George Washington could spend very little time here. He had been born in this area, his boyhood home, and yet when he was fighting for the freedom of our country, he could spend very, very little time here.
In fact, he only came back once, as I understand it, and I can imagine the elation that he must have felt as he drove up in his carriage or on his horse and saw his home.
Just think, you can feel that atmosphere, can't you, when the carriages were driving up the driveways, passing around in front of the home here, the guests alighting. What a marvelous feeling it must have been.
It's very well taken care of.
It is,
They're
indeed.
doing a beautiful job.
And somewhat smaller than you would expect as you come in. Don't you get that
It is
feeling?
much smaller, and yet they have the kitchen over here and the stables back there and many other buildings along with the house.
You know, as we stand right in front of it here, as we look forward, of course, it's the bowling green, which Washington developed shortly before the Revolutionary War, but it certainly gives an expanse, a marvelous feeling of sophistication and airiness and country living, doesn't it?
It's just beautiful.
And of course, all around us, all of the gardens, the areas where the servants worked, and then right down along the river, of course, the wharf where guests alighted when they came here by boat, and also the tomb of George Washington.
It is one of the most beautiful views of the Potomac River, I think, that I've ever experienced.
Without question. Why don't we just look around a bit?
Great. Bill, as we walk around the grounds, I experience sort of a very sweet sadness, knowing that Washington, after he gave so much to our country and to the way of freedom and fought very hard, only had a few years left at Mount Vernon before he died.
That's right. 1797, he finally returned here and then died.
You've been studying.
Died in 1799. You know, we hear the jet planes, we see the modern launches on the river and everything, and yet there still is that quiet peacefulness and that almost melancholy feeling about the whole thing.
And can you imagine being George Washington and waking up in the morning to that beautiful view?
You know, Cindy, as much as I would like to be on to the other elements of our tour, and I'm anxious to see them, there's kind of a resistance to leaving such a beautiful, peaceful setting, isn't there? Cindy, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Mueller were among the 40 Minnesotans who joined us on our bicentennial tour, and we got a nice note from them the other day thanking us for the pleasant time they had. At the end of the note it says, "I would like to ask a favor of you. My mother-in-law, Blanche Bucher, who will be celebrating her 93rd birthday on July 6th, is a big fan, always watches your program, and if you could wish her happy birthday." Certainly we could, and you know, it's an interesting thing to think about. 93 years of age, she has lived through virtually half of the history of our nation. Isn't that the kind of...
Just think of the stories she must be able to tell.
Oh my, yes. Blanche Bucher. We certainly all here at Channel 4 would like to wish her that kind of a birthday. You know, that day at the Washington, remember we saw at the beginning of the program, we saw the slide of the White House. That day at Washington was a very moving one for us, and we spent some of the time, of course, with our senators there. We arrived amidst a bit of rain.
Yes, it was terrible. We all look like drowned rats in the film if you look closely.
To meet our senators, yes. It is an imposing building, however, whether it's in the rain or in the sunshine. It is a very large building, and many members of our group had a chance to visit all the many chambers. Cindy, you and I walked around trying to find our Minnesota statues,
yes,
right?
Yes, we did. And also it was very nice that the senators were kind enough to show us some areas of the Capitol that aren't quite open to the public yet, and that is the rebuilt Senate chambers, which are really beautiful. The
two wings you see are the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the flag flies above each chamber when that chamber is in session. This, of course, is the Capitol Dome, and a gorgeous piece of architecture it is. Right now, incidentally, the Magna Carta has been sent over from England and is being displayed there. Here is the Senate chamber, which many of our people saw. I think most of our people saw either one or the other. This is the House of Representatives.
They do separate you as you go through the Capitol. Certain tours go to the representatives and the others move through the Senate.
We had a very special room that was set up by the offices of our two senators. And first of all, our senior senator from the state of Minnesota, Walter Mondale, sat down and joined us. And it's interesting, initially, we had told the folks that, think any questions you'd like to ask the senators. The first 5 minutes, everybody was very hesitant to say a word.
They seemed in awe, but what is so wonderful is that these men, prominent politicians, would take their time out to meet with a small, relatively small group of Minnesotans going through the Capitol.
And they were very eager to do so. You know, the thing that impressed me too, Cindy, is that both of these men, both Senator Mondale and Senator Humphrey, who will be arriving shortly on our film, have such a marvelous sense of history. There's HHH arriving. He walked down the hallway and said, "Hello, Billy," which isn't quite the kind of greeting you expect from Senator Humphrey in the halls of the Capitol. But in any case, they have such a marvelous sense of history, and it gives, I'm sure, great perspective to their decisions about the direction of our country.
You asked Mondale about that while we were talking with them, and he said that they don't really study it, they just absorb it and it stays with them. I suppose when you're living in Washington, D.C., that's where it all happens. You can't help but be aware.
I'm sure that is true. They, as you mentioned, they took us to two chambers, one of which, this is the old Senate chamber. I know Senator Mondale said to us that he believes that with the possible exception of the Oval Office, more serious discussion has taken place in this one room than perhaps any other room in the United States. More discussion that lent to the direction of our nation.
Senator Humphrey mentioned that he just missed being a member of that Senate chamber, the old one.
Now we are leaving to move on to the White House here. The White House, of course, is a very beautiful place, and as we were talking and discovering that it is one of the few homes of heads of state in the entire world that is open on a regular basis to its citizens. Now there are a couple of others. The Buckingham Palace is open on occasion, but the White House is open on a regular daily basis to the citizens who, of course, own this building, so we have a right to see it, and see it we do.
These are all very different rooms. This is the state dining room, and they're so huge, and they serve so many people on many occasions. It's impressive to see how they're decorated and cared for.
And there's the blue room. As we walked through, our people said, "Oh, now I'm getting onto it. The red room is decorated in red, the blue room in blue, and the gold room in gold."
Very basic.
It is, and very impressive, very beautiful. We'll be back with a few reminders of what's upcoming this week in just a moment, so don't go away. We've heard so much, Cindy, about the fact that many of the bicentennial areas are not crowded, and with the exception, I think, perhaps of the White House, which we visited on yesterday's program, I think we found that to be true, don't you think so?
Fairly true, and still they were so breathtaking. You know, I hadn't seen most of these places that we're showing you today, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of history.
I think that the one we talked about early in the program, the Washington Monument, which we have some marvelous pictures of, is certainly the dominant feature of the skyline all around Washington. You just can't miss it, even when you're miles away from the city. And of course, it's in a beautiful setting. This happens to be a view of it from the Jefferson Monument, and this from Lincoln Memorial. That reflecting pool is gorgeous, and lots of history has occurred around that. The Poor People's March on Washington, the day when Martin Luther King spoke. This is a beautiful and a stunning structure, but it doesn't compare with what's inside.
No. There are 36 columns around the structure, by the way, and they represent the 36 states that were in the making up the United States when Lincoln was president. And we mentioned about his hands. That hand that is gripped there symbolizes his strength, and the other hand, which is somewhat more relaxed, symbolizes his gentleness.
I had seen this before, and I don't think I built you up too much to see this particular statue, did I, Cindy? It's certainly one of the most moving pieces of statuary I think I've ever seen.
And as you watch it, no matter where you stand within the monument, it looks as though he's watching you.
It does, and of course there are many quotes all throughout the structure that give you a strong feeling about Abraham Lincoln. Of course, that is a little later in our history than most of what we visited. We were in Bicentennial area, and of course Abraham Lincoln came about 100 years later. Here we are arriving at the Jefferson Memorial, which once again is a similarly imposing structure. I've said to you before, Cindy, I don't know if I mentioned on the air, that if there were two people I could meet who were involved in the birth of our country, they would be Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.
He really was ahead of his time.
He was a remarkable man. This gentleman just so much enjoyed telling us about it.
And knew so much about him.
He did.
He had him down in every point.
A history major, remarkably enough, works for the National Park Service now, and loves to tell you, especially to find some association with your state, and the base of this statue rests, the statue of Thomas Jefferson rests on Minnesota marble, which he was proud to tell us. This, of course, is one of Thomas Jefferson's proudest achievements, and that was the Declaration of Independence, one of the three things he said on his tombstone that he wanted to be remembered for.
And Bill and I were talking before, you know, we all had to memorize that, I imagine, in high school, but somehow it wasn't as significant as it is when you stand there and look at that huge statue and see those words behind him.
A man of great contradictions. He was in conflict much of his life. He was a slave owner, and yet, of course, he resisted slavery. He was responsible as governor of Virginia for getting legislation passed against importation of more slaves. He was very disturbed about the fact that there was no anti-slavery clause in the Declaration of Independence. He said at that time, "Nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith than that these people shall be free." We're going to be back with more of our look around Washington in just a moment, so don't go away. Just across the Potomac, just across that bridge, right by the Jefferson Memorial from Washington, D.C., is Arlington National Cemetery. It's a very sober place, a place where you can't help but slow your life down as you watch many of the things that take place there. And of course, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is one of the more moving. That's the tomb, there it is, right in front of that building.
What I had not realized, Bill, is that there are 3 servicemen buried there. The one underneath the tomb is from World War I, and there's another serviceman from World War II and from the Korean War.
24-hour guard, honorary guard, 24 hours, 365 days a year. They change the guard every half hour during the day and every 2 hours at night. On the other side of that structure is a marvelous amphitheater, a very beautiful one.
And it was built there to hold Memorial Day services, and around that dome there is written, "When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen." Very breathtaking. I imagine it fills up about that time, too. Another thing we might mention is that the guards who do guard the tomb are from the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, which was formerly stationed, they believe, at Fort Snelling and now is at Fort Myer.
We have some pictures of the inspection, which takes place, of course, at the changing of every guard. It's a military procedure, which, of course, all men who have served time in any kind of military organization are familiar with, but this one is pursued so carefully and with such great attention to detail that it is very moving.
We noticed, too, that this sergeant is very stiff when it comes to inspection. I don't think I'd want to be married to a man like that, giving this poor fellow here the white glove test.
The sergeant of the guard, and of course there are officers of the guard who prepare the soldiers before they come out, and this is an honorary position. Many men in our armed services try to join this unit because it is an honorary position, usually for a year or so. There's that white glove treatment that you were talking about. So he's checking the chamber there, looking at his white glove to be sure that the rifle was cleaned properly.
Every movement is so defined and so well timed. It's very amazing to watch, very
intricate. Notice how he returned that rifle just with a tap on the hand, and the sentry picked it up. Now, this is the actual changing of the guard. The other sentry is walking his 21 paces, 21 measured paces back and forth. And as they make that turn, Cindy, that snap right there that you just saw is audible for, I don't know, 100 yards around, I would imagine. Now see, there's one guard replacing the other on that rubber mat there. And once again, every half hour during the day, when people are in the Arlington Cemetery grounds, that change takes place, and at night, every 2 hours. Just a little ways from that is the tomb of John F. Kennedy, and of course just down the hill from there, Robert Kennedy. As we were coming back from Washington, D.C. one night, coming across that bridge, we noted that the flame, the eternal flame, is visible right below the lit Custis Lee Mansion, which is over it. It's goosebump time.
Yes.
When you spend any
a lot of people crying at the gravesite watching that eternal flame, and of course the graves of 2 of his children who died before him.
Right out in front here now along that marble bankway you see are excerpts from many of his speeches. This particular one, "And so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And many people stop and of course take a look and just spend time in that atmosphere, as we've found so true in so many of the places we visited. People are just there absorbing atmosphere frequently.
Exactly, and there's a lot of atmosphere to absorb, no doubt about it.
We finished our time at Washington, D.C., and we were going to move on to Monticello, which is at Charlottesville, Virginia, and along the way, of course, is Skyline Drive, which is right down the top of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's a breathtaking thing, too, isn't it?
And there's our very competent driver. He took good care of us.
Jim Denton became a member of the AAA group. AAA Worldwide Travel, of course, organized that group of 40-some Minnesotans, and he became a good friend during that period of time. There's the view all along. I don't think, I've been through mountains before, but I don't think I've traveled along the top of them with the valleys below you on either side the way you do along Skyline Drive.
And we picnicked up on the mountainside, and there was a live deer who came up and sort of joined our lunch. It was adorable.
They stole our lunch.
Stole our lunch, that's more accurate.
Yes, of course, this is on the way to Charlottesville, Virginia, where Monticello is located, and of course we'll drop by Monticello on tomorrow's Midday program, and we'll be back in just a moment with some final comments. Somehow when we say the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia these days, Cindy, it doesn't bring back that historical feeling until you arrive at a place like Monticello.
Isn't it beautiful? And the home really reflects the genius of the man who built it, Thomas Jefferson.
There's no question about that. We perhaps have used the term a sobering experience a little bit too much, but it's almost impossible to be in this kind of surrounding without realizing what kind of historical impact it has.
Yes. I think what's also important is that he designed this home, and that dome in particular is very special, and he called that his sky room, the dome over the house.
It perhaps is as purely historical early American architecture as there is. He's one of the few American presidents, and we don't mean to cast aspersions to anyone, but one of the few American presidents who can really be called, quite literally, a genius in several areas, not only philosophically, architecturally, for one.
And the man who, of course, wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, no question about, of course, a marvelous writer. As we look around the area here, we find some very ingenious things he created. We were looking downstairs just a moment ago. He was able to completely put many of the service areas below vision, at least from this vantage point. So as you arrived as a guest, many of the service areas, which were so obvious in earlier structures, were not here, and yet very ingeniously designed.
Yes, and also he picked out this particular lot, and it's one of the first homes to be built on top of a mountain. What a wonderful place to build a home.
He has a commanding view of this area. It's interesting that I say he has. His presence is so totally felt, isn't it?
Yes, it is still here. I think also what's interesting to mention is the difference. As I mentioned, it reflects his personality, as did Mount Vernon for George Washington.
That's right. You know, when we were back at the Jefferson Memorial, there was a feeling, of course, we learned that he really didn't want a memorial built to him. He wanted his home to perhaps be his memorial. He wanted the Declaration of Independence to be his memorial. He didn't want an individual memorial built to him, but his genius is just so all-pervasive that you just cannot miss it.
And he wanted to share it with people, and because of that, he founded University of Virginia.
University of Virginia, his writings, all of these things last beyond him. He was a man who had to deal with many conflicts. He owned slaves, and yet he was one of the few individuals who absolutely felt that human individual freedom was absolutely important.
And that extended, of course, into freedom of religion and separation of church and state, and all his other great philosophies. We were talking also, Bill, about the fact that these men risked everything they had to fight for freedom from England. They risked a beautiful home such as Monticello, Mount Vernon. It takes a great deal of courage.
They could lose everything they had, including their lives, if they had lost against the British.
We owe them so much.
We do.
Cindy, I guess many people already know it, but Thomas Jefferson died 50 years to the day after the signing of Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826, at Monticello. And John Adams, our second president, Jefferson was our third, John Adams, our second president, died on the same day. And his last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still lives."
Pretty spooky, I think.
It's, everything about it is so moving that I'm going back yet this summer to visit some of those same places again.
Well, you're very lucky. I had not been to Monticello or any of these places before, so the trip was an exciting experience for me. But what was so interesting about Monticello were many of the inventions that Thomas and Jefferson came up with. For example, he had a clock in the front hallway that not only told time, but the day of the week.
That's right. Many of those things we saw in the pictures. Of course, we didn't have a chance to point them out. But if you have the opportunity to visit, and as you notice, the crowds are not very great. Well, we're going to take a little change of pace in just a moment, visit a purely entertainment spot, but it has some kind of historical significance as well. That's Busch Gardens in colonial Williamsburg. We'll be back in just a couple of moments.
know, Cindy, we've commented often on the fact that the old colonial feeling is often mixed with the brand new feeling. We have helicopters flying over it once again, and of course Colonial Williamsburg being next to Busch Gardens is that kind of a contrast too, although there's a lovely atmosphere here, isn't there?
And also Busch Gardens has recreated a beautiful Old English atmosphere in this part of the park.
Right, it's brand new, but it certainly creates a feeling. I'd like you to meet an old friend of ours here on Midday, Cindy. This is Alfie Howard, town crier from London.
Oh!
See that? You see why we like to have him on Midday so much?
Yeah.
Alfie, you've come from Lambeth to be with the folks at Busch Gardens.
Yes, just for the season, you know, for the summer season. I should be here.
Why don't we turn around here, Alfie, so they can see that resplendent costume.
All the summer, and it's very nice to be talking to the people of Minneapolis again, you know. That's my favourite part of America.
You've spent a lot of time with us in the Twin Cities, haven't you?
Yeah, I've done about 4 visits, you know.
Yes. Have you noticed how many, since we've been standing with Alfie, how many people have tried to buy that bell?
He has the most beautiful bell, but it's so heavy I can't even lift it.
How heavy is it, Alfie, do you know?
It weighs about 14 pounds, Bill. Well, you've got to have it heavy so that people can... It wakes you up when you've had a hangover, you know, in the morning.
That's right.
I now know the meaning of hell's bells. That's a town crier with a hangover.
Oh, there we are. Now, town crier, what is the function? What do you do now?
Well, all new local laws, statutes, legislation, etc., must be transmitted to the public by word of mouth. This comes from the days when people couldn't read or write, and this was a method of getting the laws over to them. We don't go around and say 12 o'clock and all's well, because God help anybody that was in my street shouting 12 o'clock and over, waving a 14-pound bell, you know. Yeah.
What about Busch Gardens? Lots of things here, isn't it?
It's beautiful. You know, I've told you before, I've been all over the world. I've been to Tivoli Gardens, Skansen in Sweden, Johannesburg, Run Easter Show, all over the world, these things. But this place is really fantastic and clean. This is what strikes you. I mean, you look around here, you can't see a cigarette end or anything, you know.
I saw you reminiscing with Alfie a little bit earlier about your days in Europe, huh?
Yes, I went to school in Oxford, and I told them I could live there so easily because they have the nicest people in the world over in England. Yes.
There are bells all around here, aren't there?
You're not so bad. That's a replica of Big Ben, which stands in the middle of Banbury Cross.
You know, we're going to take a look all around the park here. I understand that it has many of the conventional things that Busch Gardens normally have, then superimposed on that is the old country.
Old country, yes.
Yeah. Alfie, good to see you again.
See you, Bill.
Drop by our show when you're back in the Twin Cities.
I'm going to come back in August or September, and I'll come in and see you.
We'll welcome you then.
Thanks a lot.
In the meantime, with Alfie's help, Cindy and I are going to look around the park. You looking forward to the bird show?
I'm very excited about it, Bill.
Okay, we'll be with you in just a moment at a different location here.
Roll over. Butch, the camera's rolling. Roll over. Ready, time now? Come on now. There we go. Come on, atta boy. That's good.
That's Butch rolling over. He's better behaved than sometimes members of our staff are, I think. So.
I think that's very true, Bill.
That is Butch, and of course at Busch Gardens, my goodness, all bees. He's doing the bump for you too, just to fill out the whole complement of bees.
I was going to say he's a better dancer than our camera crew.
That's right. And Barb Bigelow, to add a few more bees, is the trainer. Butch is a macaw, Barb.
Yes, he's a scarlet macaw. He comes from South America. He ranges, he's probably around 35 years of age.
He is a very lovable fellow, but if he weren't of that disposition, he could be a very damaging fellow, couldn't he?
Yes, he has 300 pounds of force behind that beak, so he could probably break a finger or two if he really wanted to.
Let's get a close shot at that bump again. How do you teach him these things just?
Yes, one day he was doing it in his cage.
So you took my cue there.
Yes, he decided to do it. Just by the nod of the head, he picks up that cue, and he does the bump. That's how we got him to do yes.
What is the clicker for, Barb?
This is a reinforcement thing. It's a bridging signal between the behavior and the reward. When they do something good, we click, and they receive a peanut.
So he knows that the behavior he did at the time you clicked that is what gets him the reward.
It stops him from doing the behavior, too.
I see. Why don't we see? You said that he had a bicycle here, does he?
Yes, he has a scooter. This is Butch's scooter. All these props are handmade by a man down in Tampa. Okay, Butch, come on, let's ride your scooter a little bit. Oh, boy.
Cindy, it really is a special thrill to be this close to these animals as they're performing, isn't it?
I know it is, Bill, because I know that you have a parrot at home yourself and you just love them.
Yeah, they're marvelous creatures. They have such great individual personalities and are very, very bright creatures, too.
Okay,
also very conniving, as you can see. Barb has work to do. We have things to see at Busch Gardens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Butch, old man.
Would you like a kiss from Butch?
Yeah.
Like a kiss from Butch. There you go.
A kiss from Butch. Right on the nose. Lovable.
Oh, sure. There you go.
Thank you.
Y'all have a nice day now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's the old tin type from Busch Gardens. It's pure entertainment, but it's a lot of fun and a nice surrounding. A lot of people say, I thought Busch Gardens was in Florida. Well, there is one in Florida.
That's
There's
right.
one in St. Louis, one in Los Angeles. This is the newest and the biggest of them. Nice theme about it, isn't it?
It was wonderful, you know, very European, and they really recreate some of those countries very well.
It's a little ways from colonial Williamsburg. It's in the area of Williamsburg, just a little ways out of town. And once again, as we pointed out to you so frequently, the crowds weren't very great. Our AAA Worldwide Travel Group had a great time there. And tomorrow we'll show you Williamsburg itself. I'm looking forward to you sharing that with us because that's quite a place. We'll be back with some final words in just a moment. There's so many places to visit in colonial Williamsburg, it's kind of hard to know where to begin, which is the most colorful, but I guess the Governor's Palace is. It's the post right now. We're interfering with the guardsman at his duty.
Yes, we are.
Joe, what's your name?
Joe Ruzecki.
And you're a
Pfeiffer.
A Pfeiffer?
Yes, but right now I'm a sentry.
Oh, he's a sentry.
That's a difference. And you know, if he seems a little hesitant to stay here very long, it's because they're coming for the change of the guard. What happens if you're not there, Joe?
Well, they don't have a guard to change with.
That would be a problem. You know, this is such a beautiful place. Is it fun to work in this kind of surrounding?
Yes, very much. I really like it.
Do you like dressing up?
Oh, not too much. It's kind of hot.
It wasn't very comfortable garb they wore then, huh?
No, I guess not.
Do people ask you good questions, Joe?
Not most. Sometimes they do. I guess. Yes, most people are very cheerful.
About like things were in those days?
Well, not so much that. Just more directions.
I guess, Joe, you better go and assume your post. Thank you very much, Joe. You know, Cindy, this, as I said, is just one of so many buildings here in colonial Williamsburg. It really is a very impressive place, isn't it?
Beautiful. Really walking back through history. It's a strange feeling.
It is, and it's especially nice because the past and the present come together here in a rather remarkable way. I think we should go out into the back portion here and take a look at some of the beautiful gardens.
I think that's a good idea.
Good.
We are on the back side of the Governor's Palace, and as you can tell, it's just as lovely as the front side.
It is, and perhaps a little more peaceful as a result of less traffic and so forth. And of course, this was a typically European garden. I guess both the French and the English did this, and that kind of shows us how closely we are tied to that European heritage.
Yes, you can tell they pay a lot of attention to the gardens here
Isn't
at
it?
Williamsburg.
It takes a lot of help, and of course it did in those days too. They're just beautifully manicured.
In fact, an interesting fact that I've learned since I've been here is that the garden behind the Governor's Palace is just one of 100 gardens in Williamsburg.
That's really, truly remarkable. And of course, this is the kind of lifestyle one sees on the inside too. Everything impeccable. Can you imagine, Cindy, visiting a party there? Must it not have been something very special?
Oh, I wish we could go back that far and give it a try.
The dining rooms, all of the living spaces are just beautifully cared for, and I'm sure that very much as they were in those days. I think Williamsburg, more than perhaps any other place, combines the then and the now, doesn't it?
Very well, very well. You know, Bill, the Governor's Palace is so beautiful that the temptation is to spend the whole afternoon here, but unfortunately we don't have that kind of time. So why don't we take a look at some of the other buildings in Williamsburg?
Why don't we do that?
This is a copy of a British musket, most commonly known today as the Brown Bess. It's the type used both by British forces and American forces during the Revolutionary War. It's a 75 caliber smoothbore weapon, which is a muzzle loader, and also takes a priming charge in the pan of 165 to or 160 grains of black powder and a pre-measured cartridge. It also would contain a 1 ounce lead ball in the bottom. The British soldier was required during the Revolutionary War to fire his weapon 4 times a minute or in 15 seconds. The weapon has been preloaded, and I will now demonstrate by firing.
Williamsburg may be a sleepy little town now, Cindy, of about 10,000 people, but you know, during Revolutionary War days, it was one of the 5 biggest cities in the United States and most important, including New York and Washington, Boston, and Philadelphia. Williamsburg fit right in there. This building, of course, behind us here is where Patrick Henry said those immortal words, "Give me liberty or give me death."
And of course, in this very town, 5 of our presidents were educated.
It's a remarkable surrounding. We're going to visit some of the people who work and live here right now in just a couple of minutes.
There are very many craftsmen here in Williamsburg, and the one that we're visiting right now is the pewter smith. Is that what you call it, a smith?
Actually, this is the foundry. We'd be known as founders, brass founders.
You're known as brass founders, right. But what you're working with right now is pewter. What, is it just pure pewter, or are there other metals involved?
Actually, pewter's an alloy. It's basically tin, about 90% tin, 8% copper, 2% antimony.
And you have it heated up here. The metal's heated, and then you just poured it into this mold. Right. Is it considered casting then?
Right, it is casting. Pewter is poured around 650 degrees, which is comparatively low temperature for a metal, so we pour it into a permanent metal mold. Makes pewter very convenient to work with. So it only takes about 20 seconds to set up in the mold, and I can take the buttons right out.
And so that's what those are buttons?
Right.
And then they have to be sanded down and split apart?
Right. You cut the buttons from this back piece with a pair of scissors, sand them down, and then polish them up to this bright shine.
I'd like to mention that our pewter smith here, his name is Vernon Getty. And Vernon, how long have you been working here at Williamsburg?
This is my 2nd year here.
Where did you learn how to be a pewter person, pewter smith?
We learn right here in the shop. We have a master craftsman named Sven Berg who teaches us as we go along here.
So you began as an apprentice?
Right.
And do you make several pieces a day? You work every day here?
Right. We'd be casting pewter every day out here for display. Most of the pieces we actually finish are cast inside in the foundry.
Thank you very much, Vernon, for sharing with us the pewter smith. And now we're going to go on and visit Bill at another one of the craftsmen here at Williamsburg.
That expression isn't usable very often, but I just heard Dan Foster say, "Put another iron in the fire." It's an expression I've heard often, Dan, but I don't see it happen very often. You're instructing this gentleman in the art of blacksmithing. How long have you been at it?
I've been doing this about a year now.
You said that there are several blacksmiths still making a living at it in this nation.
You'll find that there are quite a few. They're just not well advertised, really.
What is the gentleman making here?
It's a small drive-in wall huck. typical hardware piece from the 18th century.
Is that the kind of thing that you'd turn out in great numbers and rather quickly once you became a very accomplished blacksmith?
Hooks and nails would be a large portion of the trade, really.
What about this shop here at Williamsburg? What sorts of things do you turn out?
Generally household goods and hardware items, things that you could use in the kitchen or the fireplace.
One of the things that has impressed me here at Williamsburg is that the jobs which seem relatively pleasant to us now were much, much more difficult years ago, weren't they?
I'm afraid it is. This job is rather hot and tiresome.
And the job of the apprentice back there, before the electric motors came along, must have been difficult.
You know, he'd have to stand and pump the bellows continuously for most of the day while the smith was doing his work.
I guess most of us think of a blacksmith as a fellow who puts the horseshoes on. Now, that's part of the work, too, but only a small part.
No, I'm afraid that wouldn't be part of the trade at all. The man who shoes the horses is actually called a farrier. He makes the shoe and puts it on the horse himself. It's just nothing to do with blacksmithing at all.
Common misconception, I would imagine?
I'm afraid so, because in the late 19th century, a lot of blacksmiths just lost their trade to competition with power tools. They took up shoeing horses, making wagon wheels, anything to earn a living. And I'm afraid Hollywood has done us a misdeed, really.
Well, it's a fascinating occupation, Dan. It's good to know that some of these fascinating things from our background are being continued, especially here at Williamsburg. Thank you for talking to us.
Oh, thank you.
Now, I think Cindy's over where they're making bricks at the moment.
The horse's name is Prince, and he's busy stirring clay here for the bricks. And Lou, you're the head brickmaker here, right?
Yes.
Now, this is native clay?
Yes, just as it comes out of the ground. Most any place below the topsoil, the clay was suitable for brick making, and it has to be mixed with water to make a mud. And this is what the horse is doing, just mixing clay and water together.
So we can just follow the path of the horse here. Now, is this the water in this barrel here?
Water in the barrel, and that's bucketed in as long as you're shoveling the clay into the pug mill. Then you can see the molder here, Mike Brown, taking the clay, rolling it in sand, and this keeps the clay from sticking to the wooden mold itself. And as you can see, he's making 4 bricks at a time. It's cast into the mold. The off-bearer comes in, carries the clay in the shape of the brick in the molds to the drying field, where it sits for several days or a week or so before it's air dried and eventually has to be baked to turn into a brick.
Now, I know you don't do the baking until the end of the season, correct?
Right, yes. We work for several weeks, several months, making enough bricks to build the kiln itself up. And once it's baked, then you just dismantle the kiln and use what bricks you've baked.
So now we're going to go over and take a look at that dismantled kiln and where the bricks will be baked at the end of the season.
Gee, we followed it all the way from mud out of the ground to the finished bricks here, Cindy. This is a fascinating way of completing the process, isn't it?
Isn't it fascinating? Look at how they throw those bricks. Good catch.
The whole thing, they actually dismantled the whole kiln that dried the bricks. You know, Colonial Williamsburg is a very, very special experience. I guess once you've been here, there's no question I'm coming back, without a doubt.
So am I. It's just beautiful, and there's so much to see. You really can't do it in one visit.
It's truly colonial, but it's a modern city as well, and it's all one just living and thriving together. Marvelous experience.
Yes, it was.